Mr. Premier, honorable dignitaries, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good morning to you all. My name is Michael Munnings, Area Vice President and Country Head for RBC Royal Bank in the Cayman Islands. RBC is pleased to sponsor this very important conference and to chair the next session, which features the Honorable Perry Gladstone Christie, Prime Minister of the Bahamas. We also want to commend the University College of the Cayman Islands for their role in hosting this conference. RBC has supported a number of UCCI's educational and cultural initiatives, and we were enthusiastic when we were approached to partner with this auspicious event. As many of you know, RBC has a long history in the Caribbean. Royal Bank of Canada opened its doors in the Bahamas in 1908, more than 100 years ago. And here in the Cayman Islands, RBC is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. Throughout our many years in the region, RBC Royal Bank has developed strong relationships with the local governments, educational institutions, and communities where we do business. It stands to reason that a bank's success, indeed our success, is wholly dependent on the quality of the relationships we build with our clients and within our communities. It is for that reason that we lead our company with integrity and sound governance practices. We strive to operate ethically, and we focus on what we can do to strengthen the economic viability of our markets. The stakes for us are very high. In the Caribbean, RBC operates in 19 countries with 116 branches serving more than 1 million clients. Across our organization, we believe it is critical for business leaders to work together with government officials and community leaders to eliminate corruption, create an environment of fair trade for economic growth, and educate clients on their rights and opportunities. This is not only the right thing to do, it makes good business sense. Corruption costs all of us money. It impedes economic growth and presents serious legal and reputational risks. For that reason, we want to do everything in our power to help build a corruption-free Caribbean. To help us move forward on that road is our next speaker, the Right Honorable Perry Gladstone Christie. Mr. Christie was sworn in as the 5th Prime Minister of an independent Bahamas on May 8, 2012. He is also the Minister of Finance for the Bahamas with responsibility for the Office of the Prime Minister, Department of Lands and Surveys, Department of Statistics, and the Ministry of Finance. Mr. Christie has had a long career in the Bahamian government, dating back to 1974, where he is believed to have been the youngest Bahamian ever appointed to the Senate. In the years following, he held a number of roles in Parliament, including Chairman of the Gaming Board, Minister of Health and National Insurance, Minister of Tourism, and Minister of Agriculture, Trade, and Industry. He studied at the University of London and Birmingham University, from which he graduated with honors. He is an attorney at law and also a founding member of the Valley Boys, an organization noted for its excellence in junk canoe. I see some heads nodding. And of the Pioneers Sporting Club. During his prepared remarks this morning, Mr. Christie will explore how the Bahamian anti-corruption institutions have secured a position of 22 out of 175 countries in the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, and lessons the Caribbean region can learn from the experiences in the Bahamas. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Prime Minister Perry Gladstone Christie.
I'd like to thank Mr. Munnings for his introduction, and I'd like to greet you and to say that it's really a privilege for me to be here with a number of Bahamians, either a part of my government, or Minister of Tourism, Minister of Financial Services, or persons who advise, like Subaltern Bethel, a long and distinguished career in the public service. But for you to truly appreciate the context of my presence as leader of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, and really appreciate the meaning of the words I speak, to those of you who are not familiar with the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, I would wish to really give you a little glimpse of the country, and by the very nature of its geophysical positioning, the challenges that the country has in everything it does. The predicate and what I build upon is that there is no model in this region for the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. And what do I mean by that? We are an archipelagic nation spread over 100,000 square miles of water. We begin 50 miles off the coast of Miami, and we stretch right along a body of water that goes down past Cuba, Haiti, touching on the Turks and Caicos Islands. We have our civilization spread amongst those islands. The island of New Providence, with the capital city of Nassau, is the financial capital of the Bahamas and the capital of the Bahamas. It is 7 by 21 in dimension, but it houses 3/4 of the population, which is just under 400,000 Bahamians. It has an extraordinary hotel stock. It has one hotel which has 8,000 employees, Atlantis, and another hotel which opens in December, hotel complex, which opens in December, which will approximately have the same amount of employees, but two mega hotels. On that island, the government has recently completed $400 million worth of expansion to our airport, making it one of the modern airports in the region, and for that matter, by definition, of world standards. The difficulty of our country is that we have to duplicate resources. So a prime minister of Barbados, for example, or Trinidad, may be looking for an airport and even a second one. We have to look for 9, 10, 12, 15. We have 21, 23 under government, a few private. Wherever people come from outside the Bahamas in, there are new standards now of international civil aviation which are predicated on security measures, and therefore you have to have this extraordinary amount of money now being spent, notwithstanding the fact that you have maybe fewer and fewer people living in these islands where resorts are being built. So that goes not just for infrastructure and airports, it goes for schools, it goes for roads. And so the country, therefore, is challenged considerably, particularly when it comes to these fundamental rights like health care. Being able to guarantee to your citizens the fundamental right of access to health care. And when they are able to watch on television from one point in the southern Bahamas to another point in the northern Bahamas, and they see that people live well and comfortably, you would appreciate, therefore, that the average citizen in these islands, having their appetites whetted by what they see, would therefore, in terms of political demands, look to the central government to provide the same quality of life for them, no matter where they live. And so, therefore, communications and provision of water, these are all fundamental areas of deep concern to the government, where, notwithstanding medical evacuations to tertiary institutions in Nassau, New Providence, or in another island, Grand Bahama. And the final point I make is, we have an island called Grand Bahama, where special provisions had been made under a Hawksbill Creek Agreement where the private sector, owners of this city called Freeport, were given extraordinary rights to govern that area in the context of an independent country, the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. And that island has an industrial base where they have petrochemical companies, pharmaceutical companies, very sophisticated processes being used there, again requiring a central government in terms of best environmental practices to have to dedicate resources to be able to deal with the issue. So that is the context in which I've come here today. Challenges that are not in any way to do with, well, put another way, these major handicapping challenges that a country has as it deals with modernizing and being able to ensure that when you come out of a recession and you have over 20% youth unemployment and people who must have the future, where you have crime as a handicapping circumstance, where you have the need for economic policies that would cause there to be employment and a resurgence in the economy, then you have appreciation of why it is so important for the Bahamas to present itself as one of the leading destinations in tourism in the region and one of the leading destinations in financial services in the region. So that is the context that I greet you, to all of you distinguished persons who are here present, and I want to begin my remarks to students who may be in the audience in that context. First of all, let me therefore express my formal gratitude for the very kind invitation extended to me to participate in this dialectic on the fight against corruption in Caribbean societies and the concomitant promotion of ethical values in all spheres of governance. May I also congratulate Dr. Livingston Smith and his staff at UCCI, along with their academic and institutional partners, for once again convening this international conference to put the microscope on a vitally important area of development of post-colonial Caribbean societies under the rubric, and I quote, "towards a corruption-free Caribbean, ethics, values, trust, and morality," end quote. While there is room for differences of opinion over the root causes of corruption and the prevalence of corrupt practices from country to country, and perhaps from region to region, there is, I would submit, virtually universal agreement that corruption in its various forms poses a formidable challenge to governments everywhere, and that international, regional, and national anti-corruption initiatives need to be strengthened to combat this scourge. Although corruption is a menace for developed and developing countries alike, it is particularly relevant for small island developing states where corruption is not infrequently linked with national development. However that may be, there is no denying that systemic corruption, whether it be in high-level political corruption, lack of financial transparency, or petty bribery among public officials and law enforcement personnel, undermines good governance and the rule of law, accelerates moral decay, fosters negative international perceptions of the country, stymies foreign investment, impedes the delivery of public services, exacerbates poverty, and, in the final analysis, retards social and economic development. Now, this may be an appropriate juncture to lay stress on the overarching truism that is central to my topic, namely that there is a moral center that undergirds anti-corruption initiatives. Thus, the best anti-corruption systems are not necessarily achieved by legislative frameworks and administrative machinery to enforce rules governing the behavior of those in public positions. While such things are of great importance and utility, probity in public life tends to be more rigorously observed in societies in which both government and the community have a shared responsibility in inculcating and observing ethical values and integrity in public and private life. Against that backdrop, what I hope to accomplish in my remarks is to spark a frank dialogue about transparency, accountability, and trust as a model of good governance. I will do so, of course, from the perspective of the Bahamas, whose government I have the honor to lead in this, my second non-consecutive term as Prime Minister. Perhaps a good place to start this discourse is to draw a reference to the international perception of the levels of corruption in the Bahamas as memorialized in the most recent Global Corruption Perception Index that I will refer to as CPI, published annually since 1995 by Transparency International. As we all know, Transparency International is an organization which has done much to focus international attention on the fight against global corruption. Its annual index has become an important tool to measure the perceived levels of public sector corruption around the world. Now, I may have been advised, I believe the organization may be represented here at this conference by its president. But in Transparency International's 2013 Corruption Perception Index, the Bahamas is ranked 22nd. 22nd on a list of the 177 countries that were evaluated with a score of 71 out of 100. The Bahamas, 71 out of 100. This puts the Bahamas just 2 points behind the United States of America and second only to Barbados in the Caribbean region, and Barbados ranks 15 with a score of 75. In fact, in the years in which the Bahamas has been ranked by this method, it has been consistently ranked in the 70 percentile, ranking 7.3 in 2010, and this is when the measurements were still on the 10-point scale, and 71 for both 2012 and 2013. These statistics are impressive, if only because of the broader historical context out of which the Bahamas developed. As is well known, the Bahamas and its various forms of government over the centuries have a long history of fighting corrupt influences going back to the pirates of the early 18th century in what is referred to by scholars as the proprietary period of constitutional development. Indeed, it was the prevalence of piracy and the associated corruption of the body politic in this period that precipitated the transition of the Bahamas to rulership by the British Crown in 1717 with the appointment of Woodes Rogers as the first of the royal governors who would preside over the Bahamas as viceroys of the British monarch until the attainment of Bahamian independence in 1973. Now, such a morally ambiguous heritage has naturally provided an abundance of what are now popularly referred to, and I quote, as teachable moments, unquote. One such moment occurred in the aftermath of the Commission of Inquiry into casino gambling in 1967, in which it was revealed that virtually the entire former cabinet of the Bahamas, and this was in the era of white minority rule, but the entire cabinet had been systematically corrupted, along with a range of other important persons of influence in the society. Similarly, again, in the aftermath of another commission of inquiry, this time the 1984 Commission of Inquiry into Drug Trafficking, there was a great deal of national introspection and soul-searching in the wake of powerful suggestions, if not concrete findings, that high-ranking persons in politics and in law enforcement, and indeed many persons of less exalted station, had been contaminated by the drug culture, much to the detriment of the country's reputational standing abroad, and indeed much to the detriment of self-image of Bahamians generally. But the Bahamas of yesteryear is a far cry from what exists now. Today, there is a panoply of international and domestic frameworks, political and civil institutions, NGOs and civil society, which combine to achieve transparency and accountability in the Bahamas and in the Bahamian government as part of what might compendiously be termed the Bahamas Anti-Corruption Framework. The reason I say that these initiatives comprise the anti-corruption framework is because the Bahamas does not have a comprehensive written policy on corruption or a unified anti-corruption framework with a single watchdog agency or oversight body, such as an integrity commission or an anti-corruption commission. Instead, anti-corruption has been addressed through a range of measures and devices, including strong democratic traditions, good governance policies, legislative initiatives, vibrant political and civil institutions, a free and vigorously investigative media, including internet media, most of which is under private ownership and control, and a raft of anti-corruption initiatives that are to be found at many levels of the public service and the public at large. Now, while I do not wish to downplay the added value that formal bodies such as those established by treaties bring to the fight against corruption, and it is accepted that these institutions will inevitably have to become an integral part of our domestic framework, it must be appreciated that none of them represents a magic wand. For example, a recent constitutional commission established by my government to consider constitutional reform reported that after studying the office of ombudsman in the region, there was, and I quote, little evidence in the literature to suggest that this office has lived up to its billing, end quote, citing issues such as lack of coercive powers. In fact, it bears noting that the Bahamas CPI score outranks many countries that have formal anti-corruption oversight bodies and specific anti-corruption laws. Social scientists and academics might see this as an irony or perhaps even an anomaly worthy in either case of further investigation and study. I will return to this idea later in my remarks, but let me now provide a conspectus of some of the components of our national anti-corruption framework. And I go to legal framework. Despite the lack of a single or primary anti-corruption legislation, the Bahamas has a robust international and domestic legal framework for combating corruption. Of particular note, the Bahamas is a party to the major anti-drug and anti-corruption conventions. In fact, the Bahamas has the distinction of being the very first country in the world to ratify the 1988 United Nations Convention Against Illicit Drug Traffic in Narcotics, Drugs, and Psychotropic Substances. The 1988 convention, we refer to it as. We have also ratified the major anti-corruption convention, including the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption. As you would know, both these conventions contain comprehensive anti-corruption provisions and requires states to assume jurisdiction over a wide range of corruption offenses, including domestic and foreign bribery, extending even to the prevention against criminalization of private sector bribery, and to establish national oversight bodies. The Bahamas is also a party to the mechanism for follow-up on the implementation of the Inter-American Convention and participates in the implementation review mechanism for UNCAC, Regulation of Financial Services Sector. Although not contained in any formal treaty regime, one of the international initiatives in the area of promoting transparency and accountability for the regulation of the financial services industry has been the work of the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, through which the Bahamas energetically participates as a member of the regional subgroup Caribbean FATF. I should also mention that the Attorney General of the Bahamas, Senator the Honorable Alison Maynard Gibson, is the current chair of CFATF, or CFAFT, I beg your pardon, and under her leadership, the organization has embarked on an 11-point plan which aims to establish a strong culture of compliance with FATF AML CFT standards to ensure financial strength and stability in the region and, for that matter, in the world. The Bahamas is also slated to undergo a comprehensive peer review of its AML-CT financing systems this year by the CFATF, and we look forward to working with our regional partners in this regard. The importance of a strong anti-money laundering regime in a national framework to combat corruption cannot be overstated. Money laundering and the presence of large quantities of illicit money in a financial system not only promotes criminal activities and other social ills, but it does feed corruption. It is no secret that the large amounts of money from narcotics that flooded the Bahamas during the late 1970s and early 80s contributed significantly to widely perceived, if not actually proven, levels of corruption. However, once stringent legislation and law enforcement activities were put in place to deal with the substantive drug trafficking offenses, as well as to cut off the flow of money and to seize and confiscate the proceeds of drug trafficking assets, this greatly reduced the opportunistic corruption that sprung up around the use of the Bahamas as a transshipment point for drugs. Certainly, the anecdotal evidence points to that result. Our domestic framework. It is also important to note that while the emergence of new forms of transnational crime and transnational bribery have driven the development of multilateral treaty regimes for fighting corruption, there have always existed a variety of legal and administrative measures in our domestic arsenals to fight corruption, many of which were a part of our inherited legal systems. In fact, part of the delayed reaction to effectively implementing anti-corruption conventions regimes in the region have been the need to first identify what provisions are already covered in the mosaic of existing laws and regulations that we have. For example, there are in the Bahamas, as in virtually most Caribbean states, laws ranging from constitutional provisions requiring members of parliament to disclose interest in government contracts, constitutional provisions which establish and empower the office of the Auditor General as the supreme audit institution, various parliamentary oversight bodies and investigatory committees with vast powers to investigate and call for papers, including of particular note, a standing public accounts committee which has an opposition-controlled majority of members in Parliament, criminal sanctions under legislation ranging from the Penal Code to specific legislation dealing with the prevention and criminalization of corruption offenses, legislation providing for the disclosure of the financial affairs of members of Parliament and senior public officials, which admittedly has not proven to be a model of scrupulous observance, financial rules and regulations dealing with public procurement and tendering, specific oversight bodies and tribunals to deal with matters arising among the disciplined forces and uniformed branches of our respective countries, defense force, police force, prisons, and various codes of conduct for public servants found in documents such as public service regulations and general orders, which lay down a code for the performance of their duties in a way that is designed to thwart conflicts of interest and attendant abuses. All of these legislative provisions and mechanisms have been used and pressed into service in some way or another as part of the national fight against corruption in the Bahamas. I should now like to look briefly at some of the key public institutions and national integrity systems, as well as some of the non-state actors in the ongoing effort to promote transparent, accountable, and honest government in the Bahamas. I begin by looking at the legislature. The legislature of the Bahamas can be traced back to 1729, making it the third oldest legislative assembly in the Western Hemisphere. I highlight this to illustrate the fact that the Bahamas enjoys a long, unbroken tradition of lawmaking revolving in the main around a popularly elected assembly. Although the party system has been the dominant feature of the Bahamian parliamentary life for the past nearly 60 years, the spirit of independent thought has continued to resonate. In point of fact, it is not unusual for members of parliament from the governing party, or for that matter, the opposition, to espouse views during legislative debates that are contrary to the policy line of their party. The tolerance, or this tolerance of backbencher spirit, is a healthy safety valve that aids in the promotion of vigorous public discourse and accountability. Elections. The strong democratic traditions of the legislature have been bolstered for a long time by our long history of free, fair, and nonviolent general elections. At the invitation of the Bahamas government, the 2012 general elections in the Bahamas was observed by Organization of American State Electoral Observation Mission, CARICOM Observation Mission, which reported that the elections were free and fair. Indeed, the mission even congratulated the Bahamas for the way in which voters exercised their franchise. The right to elect a government and to keep it accountable through the ballot box is very jealously guarded by Bahamians. Voter statistics for general election in the Bahamas since 1972 indicate that the lowest voter turnout has been around 88%. I want you to observe this, because when we speak of legislating morality, the ultimate coercive force, the determining factor in democracies will always be the people having the right to pass judgment on you and your conduct as they see it. So the right that they have becomes an important anti-corruption instrument. So the lowest voter turnout around 88%, but that the average turnout has been in the 90 percentile range over 9 election cycles, over 90%. It is the kind of participatory democracy that fosters public oversight and sanction of political leaders and helps in the longer run to maintain integrity in the democratic process. There are some areas, however, which are admittedly in need of reform. And there have been recommendations from both the OAS Observer Mission and the Constitutional Commission to address the issue of the financing of political parties and campaigns, and to enhance the accountability of members to constituents once they're elected. Again, these are issues that have been the subject of recommendations made specific from the Constitutional Commission, whose report was submitted to the government in July of last year, and which incidentally is available online on the Bahamas government's website. I now look to the executive. Fidelity to the performance of their legal and public duties by elected public officials is also aided by a code of ethics promulgated during my first term in office. Indeed, in 2002, I tabled a code of ethics for ministers, which also extended to parliamentary secretaries in the House of Assembly at the opening of Parliament. Unlike many codes, it was primarily intended to be, and has been, a moral signpost, or I should say, like many codes, it was primarily intended to be a moral signpost and guide for the conduct of political decision-making in our country. And in introducing this code, I'd like to quote what I said, and I now quote: "If public confidence in the integrity of the political director of the Bahamas is to become a hallmark of our political culture, it is of the first importance that the Prime Minister and other ministers of government observe and be seen to observe the highest standards of probity in public life," end quote. I believe in leading by example, and it is clear that one of the necessary ingredients for the success of any national initiative to fight corruption is sustained political will and the power of personal example. Indeed, if I may be permitted a brief burst of boastful pride, there is nothing in the whole of my more than 40 consecutive years, and this year is my 40th consecutive year in public life. And I argue that there's nothing more that I can say about myself and my presence in frontline politics, of which I am more proud than the fact that there has never been any serious allegation of corruption leveled against me. And in a place of intense scrutiny and frequently malicious partisanship like the Bahamas, that is really saying something, and I can assure you of that. But I'm really proud of that record, because say what they like about me, and they've called me all kind of things, plenty unkind things. It is, I think, generally accepted that for Perry Christie, integrity in the conduct of the people's affairs is absolutely central to his personal ethos and to his personal philosophy of governance. And as long as I have any breath in my body, that's the way it's going to be with me. As for the code of ethics itself, It stresses the point that transparency and probity in public life can only be maintained if ministers uphold their positions and powers and trust for the benefit of the Bahamian people. If those of us who form the government devote ourselves to ministerial service as full-time occupation, that we avoid any material conflict between private interests and public duties, avoid using ministerial status or influence for the enrichment of themselves, ourselves, and their families, our families. Avoid all forms of ethically improper behavior, including the solicitation or acceptance of personal gifts and loans from organizations or individuals who are seeking to obtain or retain the patronage or favor of the government. Those are the mandates and the dictates for the executive. I move to the judiciary. An independent, impartial, and incorruptible judiciary with administrative capacity to support its functions and the ability to check abuses by other branches is important to accountable government. In this regard, there are few, if any, institutions in the Bahamas which have remained as unimpeachable as our judiciary. So much so that even whispers of corruption have only very rarely been heard over the years. The Bahamian judiciary has indeed been like Caesar's wife for virtually all of its modern life. It really has a record of integrity of which we are all very proud. It is often bandied about in regional and international circles, and especially in those countries with highly developed financial services or technology sectors, that one of the reasons for the retention of the Privy Council as the highest court of appeal is to inspire investor confidence in the judiciary. Now, there is a kernel of truth in this, but it really does a disservice to our local courts. The fact is that only a minuscule number of cases and litigants ever make it to the Privy Council. Instead, the High Court, or Supreme Court, as it is called in our jurisdiction, and lower levels of the judiciary are the fount of justice for the vast majority of our citizens. The position of the courts in the Bahamas was perhaps best articulated by a judge in a case involving an alleged lack of independence stemming from the government's failure to conduct a statutory required biennial review of judges' salaries, coupled with public comments from the then Attorney General arguing for the accountability of judges to the public for dereliction of duty. This is what the court said in response, and I quote, "The fair-minded, informed observer would be aware of the centuries-long tradition of judicial independence of the courts of the Bahamas. And he would be aware that judges discharge their judicial functions without fear or favor, affection or ill will. And he will be aware that despite the failure of government to review salaries and to adequately compensate judges, they continue to perform their judicial duties in accordance with their oaths," end quote. And I quote again, "That observer would also discover that judges are accountable only to the Constitution and to the law for their decisions, and that there are no performance appraisals of judges by anyone within or outside the judiciary," end quote. That speaks for the judiciary and the independence of the judiciary and the bastion of stability of our country. An independent director of public prosecutions. Many of you would be also aware that the Bahamas remains one of the few countries in the region, indeed in the Commonwealth for that matter, with an Attorney General who is also a necessary member of the Cabinet and who remains constitutionally responsible for public prosecutions. Nearly all other countries, as you know, have long since transitioned to a model under which a political attorney general has either no or very limited powers in relation to criminal prosecutions, with a constitutionally independent director of public prosecution having these powers instead. It should be noted that in the Bahamas we have a director of public prosecutions, but this is not, at least not yet now, a constitutional office with security of tenure. Be that as it may, successive attorney generals in the Bahamian context have functioned impartially and free from any party or political influences, a reality that I attribute not only to the constitutional prescription which facilitates or insulates the Office of Attorney General from any interference by other bodies, but also because of what has emerged as the norm for most of the post-independence experience, namely that the Attorney General should be an appointed senator and not an elected politician accountable to his constituents. However, the Constitutional Commission has recommended that the establishment of an independent office of Director of Public Prosecution is one of the reforms that should be fast-tracked by my government. On this point, I should also mention, if not parenthetically, that in 2001, the Bahamas held a constitutional referendum which attempted, amongst other reforms, to create a constitutional office of Director of Public Prosecutions. But the bill failed at referendum. In a lecture I delivered last year in Nassau, captioned Contemporary Constitutionalism and the Consent of the Governed, I highlighted the unpredictable nature of the referendum process and pointed out that while the referendum was an important instrument of participatory democracy, it can sometimes present an obstacle to implementing changes in constitutions with entrenched provisions. Other recent experiences of a similar nature in certain CARICOM states lend credence to this concern.